In my last two videos, I gave you a rundown on my non-feminism, then I gave you a rundown on my anti-feminism. In this one, I'm going to talk about how and why I became a men's rights activist. I think in order to do that, I should first explain to you what being a men's rights activist means to me. For me, human rights activism in general is balanced on the understanding that if something is a human right, that applies to all human beings. And that if something is considered to be a responsibility of adulthood as a member of your society that you can be held legally accountable for, that applies to all adults. And because of that, before I became a men's rights activist, I became a men's rights advocate. Because of all of the many times that I saw it argued or asserted that it was all right to infringe on men's human rights for the purported benefit of women. This expanded, again, once internet access became more available to me and I started seeing more and more forums where these arguments were made. In particular, the right to due process has been under attack for most of my life. This came to my attention more when I was in college and I began seeing news articles about the promotion of the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act was promoted as if there was no other legislation in place to handle domestic violence, as if there was no system in place for domestic violence victims, and as if there were no resources in place for domestic violence victims advocates. These things were all false. In 1984, Ronald Reagan signed the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act into law. This established shelters, it established funding for advocacy, it established legal standards that guided police and the court systems to treat violence in the home as still being violence and still meriting prosecution. So after 1984, a system was created to allow abused family members of either sex an escape from their abusive environment. Feminists lobbied to change that, and they succeeded with the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. The first and most obvious thing that the Violence Against Women Act did was gender the law. Initially, it was a family violence law. It did not matter which sex the individual was who was abused. If somebody needed to leave the home and go to a shelter and find their way to a new home, the law protected that. If someone needed recourse in law, in court, in order to protect themselves from a violent partner, the law facilitated that. After the Violence Against Women Act passed, men who were victims were cut out. The law altered the standards for shelter funding to facilitate kicking men and boys out of shelters. Today, it is rare in the United States to find a shelter that accommodates men and boys equally to the way it accommodates women and girls. In fact, many shelters do not accommodate men and boys at all, except to send them to anger management classes. In addition to this, law enforcement and court personnel mandates were also changed. Now, rather than simply acknowledging that violence committed inside the home was the same as violence committed outside the home in the eyes of the law enforcement and court personnel are required to look at a woman's accusation as true, unless it is proven false. After beginning with the guilty until proven innocent standard, law enforcement is also expected to use a mandatory arrest policy. Prosecutors are expected to use mandatory prosecution policies. The court is expected to use the guilty until proven innocent standard and the listen and believe standard. So we end up in a situation wherein a man who was accused of domestic violence needs not only to demonstrate that there is not evidence that he committed the crime, but to show evidence against the accusation, and it needs to be substantial evidence. Beyond these mandatory arrest, mandatory prosecution policies, and essentially a mandatory conviction policy, there's also mandatory sentencing and mandatory time served. So not only is due process threatened. It's trampled. In addition to the attack on due process and the exclusion of male victims from the domestic violence victims advocacy system, the Violence Against Women Act ensured funding for studies done on these women-only shelters in order to build a false body of evidence that would indicate, because men were excluded, that domestic violence was a problem experienced by women, but committed only by men. And when that began impacting on the men around me, it took several years before I understood what was going on. At the very first, I thought it was stupid local judges that had prejudices against men, or prejudices against certain ethnicities, or prejudices against the poor, and no idea that this was actually mandated by the law. And so, for years, I watched the men around me get the short end of the stick in the legal system in conflicts with women. I have a friend who was convicted of assault for stopping a woman's second attempt at stabbing him in the throat. I've seen 2 men deal with ex-wives using "I'll say you hit me" to get custody agreements out of them that they didn't want to sign. One of them was my husband. I've seen several men around me deal with parental alienation and custody interference. One of them was also my husband. Now, our kids are all adults. It's kind of water under the bridge now, and I'm not trying to complain about the ex-wife. But I will say that a lot of what actually took me from advocacy to activism was looking for help with that situation. One of the things I learned when I was looking for help with our custody situation was that there wasn't much out there. In fact, we were advised that getting custody was probably our least likely option. When the ex-wife moved to get out of the custody agreement, the only choice we had was to move as well. So we did. Picked up and left our jobs and left our families and moved halfway across the state. Now, by this time, I had seen discrimination in both criminal and family court systems in 3 counties in my state. I had some inkling that it wasn't just judicial bias, but I had no idea how bad it was until I moved to the Dayton metro area, and I met the fellow that I wrote about in the 7 Years in Hell story that is published on A Voice for Men. And the 7 Years in Hell story, which I will link in the low bar, is a brief description of a 7-year ordeal that my friend faced in both the Montgomery County and Greene County court systems. In his situation, his ex-wife got away with not only making numerous false accusations, filing numerous false charges, she perjured herself repeatedly. And she was caught not only by the court system itself, by the police, by the prosecutor, and by judges in these acts, but it was witnessed by local domestic violence victims advocates who were helping her, and they continued to help her. This case included false assault charges, false restraining orders, false charges of violating those restraining orders, a false rape charge, and at one point it got so ridiculous that my friend was taken in for questioning for a drive-by greeting that never happened. As that case unfolded, I originally began writing about it for a social network that no longer exists as a social network. It's now a news site, and very few people that were there are still involved in it. But at that time, I was heavily involved in that site, and I put a piece up every time there was a new happening in the case. And at one point, the vexatious litigant found the blog posts. And even though I had kept everything anonymous, I didn't name her, I didn't name him, didn't name anyone involved, didn't even say particularly which counties this was taking place in, she demanded that they be taken down. She outed herself, gave her real name in the comments, and then claimed that I was attacking her personally because she was identified. Pretty neat trick, huh? And of course, the site censored the posts, and I didn't fight it at the time because when a vexatious litigant threatens to sue, you take it seriously. So I reevaluated my writing, and I figured out that the really important thing in this was that the phenomenon needed to be known and understood. And what those of us who rallied around my friend did that worked versus what wasn't working and what actually made the case drag on longer needed to be said. So I came up with the blog Breaking the Glasses, which was intended to sort of break through the rose-colored filters through which we view women's actions and feminist ideology and get people thinking about what's actually right when it comes to human rights. Get people thinking about treating people equally from a standpoint where equal treatment isn't equality of outcome necessarily, but equality of opportunity, equality of recognition of and consideration for human rights. Now, up until this point, my involvement with men's rights had been more advocacy than activism, although I had some activities that would be more considered real-world activism. I had helped my college friend raise money for his defense, and I'd helped a couple of guys find information on fathers, not necessarily fathers' rights, but fathers' resources. Also helped a couple of guys find legal assistance. But nothing like we would encounter with the vexatious litigant that we were dealing with in the 7 Years in Hell story. This actually took round-the-clock monitoring of the victim in order to make it impossible for the vexatious litigant to file a false accusation against him, file a false charge against him, without there being a witness and physical evidence to prove what he actually was doing at the time. And of course, I was one of the people who spent time with him to make sure that he had somebody there who could testify as to what he was doing and where he was at any given time. And in addition to that, I went to court with him. So he was really the first falsely accused man that I went to court with. Because of that, writing about his case did come naturally. And promoting the information about his case also came naturally because this was something that I realized people needed to know about. I'd seen enough of it now, and I realized it was happening in 5 different counties in my state, that I knew it wasn't just a local issue, that there was legislation behind it. And as I began to research what the legislation was, I was appalled. The more I learned about the Violence Against Women Act, the more I realized people needed to know what our society had agreed to. People needed to know what we had replaced the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act with. So in between when I started writing the original blog posts that eventually were removed and the Breaking the Glasses blog posts that still get referenced, I began interacting on Reddit's men's rights subreddit. In fact, the first time I posted on Reddit, I don't think there were very many subreddits. The men's rights subreddit only had about 3,000 people in it when I started. But it was still a place where people who would be interested in the information would read it and potentially pass it on to others. So it created the opportunity to raise awareness of the problem and hopefully connect with people who would work with me on lobbying to change it. The men's rights label itself was not something that I just picked up one day and decided to wear. It was something that was actually slapped on me by members of Shit Reddit Says for being a poster in the men's rights subreddit. It was used as a pejorative. Think about that for a minute. Advocating for equal treatment under the law. Advocating that if something is a human right, it applies to both sexes. The label for that is used as a pejorative. What does that tell you about Shit Reddit Says? So as that was going on, and as the case continued, and I continued to write about it and talk about it, and as I began to interact with other people who posted in the men's rights subreddit, and I watched how Reddit interacted with the men's rights subreddit, I realized that there really was a need for people to be involved in an overall movement. And I decided that if they were going to slap me with that label for advocating for equal human rights, well, I'll wear it. And that set me on a path of not only writing about men's rights, but also acting as needed. I've gone to court with falsely accused men. I've been able to help men find legal assistance when they've needed it, mainly just through knowing internet sources for information on legal assistance. I've also been able to provide advice to men who've faced false restraining orders on how to protect themselves. And I'm hoping that the continued availability of that advice will help to make using restraining orders as a form of attack instead of as a form of protection that they were intended to be useless. And I guess the last thing that I really ought to say on this, with respect to men's rights activism and my being a men's rights activist, is to explain how long I'm going to do this, because I've had people ask me that. When are you going to stop? What's enough? And my answer is pretty simple. It goes right back to the goal of making it normal to have equal consideration for human rights regardless of sex, and to have equal recognition and equal protection under the law for those human rights regardless of sex, to have equal accountability under the law regardless of sex. So if something is illegal for a man to do, it's illegal for a woman to do. If something is a man's legal right, it's a woman's legal right. And if it's a woman's legal right, it's a man's legal right. You can't have responsibility go one way, and you can't have rights go one way. When we get to a point where there is no need to fight for that because we have achieved it, I won't have to do this anymore. And I can go back to playing video games. But until then, I'm not going to stop. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight as to why I do what I do. And that's the end of the series. Although in the future I may add more things to this if stuff comes up. So rather than say the end, I will simply say until next time.